At 7:14 on the morning of February 18, 1944, a single M4A2 Sherman was halfway up a frozen ridge outside the village of Novobuta, south of Shepetivka in western Ukraine, when its tracks began to slide backward. The slope was no more than 60 meters long. But it was coated in hard, wind-polished ice, formed after 2 days of thaw followed by a sudden night freeze. The Sherman's diesel engine roared, exhaust steaming white into the gray air, but the hull drifted sideways like a sled. Below the ridge, German Panzergrenadiers were already moving into position. 3 minutes later, a Panzer IV Osv would fire its first ranging shot. And standing in the open beside the sliding tank, hammer in his hand, was a Red Army mechanic who had just finished bolting a modification to the Sherman that no one else in the battalion believed would work. How did a foreign-built tank, nearly helpless on ice, become the only machine able to climb that ridge? The answer began 3 days earlier, when the ridge did not yet matter. The 1st Guards Tank Army had been ordered to push west after the collapse of German positions east of the Horn River. Their task was to cut secondary supply roads feeding Wehrmacht units withdrawing toward Poland. Novobuta was not a target on any major map. It was a name scribbled in pencil on a divisional overlay, beside a narrow forest track that curved between low hills and frozen marshland. That track, however, crossed a single ridge of exposed limestone before dropping into open farmland. Whoever controlled that ridge controlled the road. On February 15, reconnaissance from the 3rd Guards Mechanized Brigade reported German infantry and at least 2 assault guns in the area. Their positions could not be flanked easily. To the north lay swamp frozen only on the surface. To the south, dense pine forest and deep snow limited movement to foot patrols. The plan was simple. At dawn on the 18th, a small armored detachment would seize the ridge. Infantry would follow. Artillery would not be used. Surprise was essential. One of the tanks assigned to that detachment was M4A2 Sherman serial T27183, a diesel variant supplied under Lend-Lease and issued to the Red Army the previous autumn. Its crew had named it quietly, in chalk inside the turret, Zarya, Dawn. Zarya's mechanic was senior technician Sergei Mikhailovich Karpov, age 36, born near Yaroslavl, trained before the war in railway engine repair. He had joined the army in 1941 and spent 2 winters keeping machines alive that should not have survived. Karpov did not trust ice. He had seen tanks slide into ravines near Kalinin in 1942. He had watched drivers freeze at the controls as machines lost grip and turned sideways under fire. Steel and ice, he knew, did not negotiate. On February 16, during a short test movement near Novobuta, Zarya attempted to climb a low frozen slope similar to the ridge. The track spun uselessly. The tank drifted backward and nearly struck another vehicle. The driver blamed the ice. The commander blamed the engine. Karpov said nothing, but that night he examined the tracks by lantern light. The Sherman standard track grousers were designed for mud and soft ground. On ice, they became smooth shoes. No amount of engine power could change that. On the morning of the 17th, Karpov reported his concern to the company commander. He was told that there were no replacement tracks and no time for experiments. The ridge would be taken by momentum. Karpov returned to his vehicle and began looking for metal. Behind the village were the remains of a German field position abandoned weeks earlier. Among the debris were broken barbed wire posts, steel anti-infantry stakes, and fragments of horseshoes from dead transport animals. Karpov gathered what he could and dragged it back to the maintenance area. That evening, he proposed his idea to the crew. They would turn the Sherman's tracks into ice claws. Using a hand drill, hammers, and a welding torch scavenged from a destroyed repair truck, Karpov planned to bolt and weld short steel spikes onto every second grouser. The spikes would bite into ice like mountaineer crampons. The gunner said the idea was madness. The loader said the tracks would break. The driver said the tank would shake itself apart. Karpov answered only that the ridge would not move. They worked through the night, fingers numb, breath freezing in their scarves. Each spike was cut from German wire stakes and hammered flat at one end. Horseshoe nails were driven through drilled holes to hold them in place. Where nails failed, Karpov welded. By dawn, Zaria's tracks looked like the jaw of an animal. Other crews laughed when they saw it. German prisoners, used as labor, stared silently. At 6:20 on February 18, the detachment moved out. Snow creaked under steel. Engines groaned as oil thickened in the cold. The temperature was -18 degrees. The ridge appeared ahead, pale and smooth, rising out of frozen scrub. Zaria went first. At 7:12, the Sherman began its climb. At 7:14, halfway up, the hull shifted. The left track bit. The right slid. The tank began to drift sideways, nose pointing toward open ground. Karpov was already out of the vehicle before the commander finished shouting. He ran alongside the moving tank, boots slipping, eyes on the right track. Several spikes had bent backward under load. One had torn free. "Stop engine," he shouted. The driver cut power. The tank slid another meter and stopped, angled dangerously. Below, in the shallow trees at the base of the ridge, movement flickered. German infantry were there. A burst of rifle fire snapped past the tank, striking ice. The other Shermans behind Zaria halted, unable to advance while the lead vehicle blocked the path. Karpov knelt beside the track and began hammering bent spikes straight again, working in full view of the ridge. The commander yelled for him to get back inside. Karpov did not look up. He had minutes at most. From the far side of the ridge came the low, heavy sound of an engine not built in America. A Panzer IV was starting its climb from the German side. If Zaria could not move, nothing behind it could move. And if the Germans reached the crest first, the ridge would become a firing platform. Karpov finished straightening the last spike and reached for the welding torch. The wind blew his flame sideways. Another rifle cracked. Ice splintered near his knee. He struck the torch again. Behind him, the Sherman's engine began to idle, waiting for his signal. Above, the ridge remained silent. But the sound of German armor was getting closer. Karpov struck the torch a third time. The flame held, thin and blue in the wind. He pressed it against the base of the loosened spike, melting old weld and letting fresh metal flow. His hands shook, not from fear but from cold so deep it made fingers feel like wood. A bullet snapped past his shoulder and struck the Sherman's hull with a flat clang. The commander leaned out of the turret. "Sergei." "Inside." Karpov did not answer. He finished the weld, kicked the spike with his boot, and nodded once to himself. He slapped the side of the hull. "Slow power," he shouted. "Not full." The driver eased the throttle. The engine deepened in tone. Black smoke drifted across the ice. The left track began to turn. Its spikes bit into the frozen surface with a grinding, tearing sound, like iron claws on stone. The right track hesitated, then caught. The tank shuddered, tilted, then straightened. Karpov ran alongside for 2 steps, watching the spikes dig in. Then he dove back through the side hatch as the Sherman began to climb again. Behind Zaria, the second tank started forward, its own smooth tracks already slipping. Zaria climbed slowly, painfully, like an animal pulling itself up a frozen bank. Each meter was earned by noise, metal on ice, diesel under strain, welds creaking. Inside, the crew was silent except for the driver's breathing. At 7:17, Zaria reached the crest. The ridge top was narrow, barely wide enough for the hull. On the far slope, 30 meters away, the gray-green shape of a Panzer IV was emerging, its long gun already lifting. "Forward, forward," the commander said calmly. The Sherman lurched ahead just as the German tank fired. The shell passed behind them, exploding in ice and earth where they had been moments earlier. Zaria slid forward and down the far side, spikes screeching, then stabilized as snow replaced ice. Behind, the second Sherman tried to climb the ridge and failed, sliding back at an angle. The German tank's turret turned. Seria fired first. An armor-piercing round struck the Panzer IV's glassy plate and deflected, sparking. The German fired again, hitting Seria's left front fender, tearing metal but not penetrating. The crew loaded another round. Below the ridge on the German side, Panzergrenadiers were already spreading out, rifles and machine guns aimed upward, firing at the Soviet tank now above them. Seria's gun fired again. This time the shell struck the Panzer IV's turret ring. The German turret jammed half-turned. Smoke poured from its engine compartment. The German crew bailed out, 2 men running downslope before machine gun fire from Soviet infantry cut them down. The ridge was taken by 1 tank. But Seria was alone. The other Shermans could not climb. Their tracks spun uselessly, sliding backward under fire. One struck a rock and threw a track. German infantry, seeing the lead tank isolated, began moving uphill from both sides, using shallow folds in the ground for cover. Inside Seria, Karpov watched the track gauges. The modified spikes were holding, but the strain was enormous. The right track was already showing signs of tearing around the bolts. "Commander," he said quietly, "we cannot stay long. The tracks will not last." The commander nodded. "Then we make it short." They turned Seria sideways across the ridge, using its hull as a shield for the stalled tanks below. The gun fired again and again, high explosive rounds bursting among German infantry climbing the slope. German machine guns answered. Bullets rattled against the hull like thrown gravel. Below, Soviet infantry began moving, using Seria as moving cover. Men ran from the shadow of the ridge into the open, climbing where the tanks could not. At 7:29, the 2nd Panzer IV appeared from behind the ridge on the German side. It advanced cautiously, its commander already aware of what had happened to the first. Seria fired. The shell struck the Panzer IV's mantlet and ricocheted. The German answered. The shot hit Seria's turret side, denting armor and spraying metal fragments inside. The loader cried out, blood running from his cheek. Karpov grabbed him and pulled him back from the breach. "Stay low," he said. The driver reversed slightly, trying to angle the hull, but the spikes bit too hard. The tank did not slide, it lurched, stressing the tracks. A loud crack came from below. The right track sagged. One of the welded spikes had torn free, ripping a section of track with it. The tank could still move, but not much. "Commander," Karpov said, "we have minutes. Maybe less." The commander looked at the ridge behind them. Soviet infantry were now halfway up, using shell craters and broken ice for cover. "Then we hold until they are here," he said. The German tank fired again. This time the shot struck Seria's lower hull, penetrating into the engine compartment. Diesel fuel sprayed, but did not ignite. Smoke filled the interior. The driver began to cough. Karpov ran to the engine hatch, opened it, and threw snow inside to cool the area and smother vapor. The engine still ran. The gun fired again. This time the shell struck the Panzer IV's side armor. The German tank stopped, smoke pouring out. Its crew fled. German infantry wavered. At 7:41, the 1st Soviet infantry reached the ridge top. They threw grenades downhill and fired into German positions. The ridge was no longer empty behind Seria. But the tank itself could not move far. The right track finally broke at 7:44, sagging completely. The Sherman settled in place, immobile. The commander ordered the engine stopped. The ridge, however, was held. By 8:10, German resistance faded. Those who could retreated into the forest. Those who could not lay still on the frozen slope. The road through Novobuta was open. Seria did not move again that day. Later, when Soviet engineers arrived, they studied the tracks in silence. Some shook their heads. Some nodded slowly. Karpov stood nearby, hands black with soot and frozen grease, watching them. One officer asked him why he had done it. Karpov answered simply, "Ice does not care about courage. Only teeth." By noon, a light snow had begun to fall, softening the sharp edges of the ridge and covering the dead. The broken Sherman stood where it had fought, its hull scarred, its tracks twisted into shapes no factory had designed. The infantry passed it in silence as they moved west. Some touched the hull with their gloves, as if it were a grave marker. A recovery team arrived in the afternoon with a Comintern tractor and 2 teams of engineers. They studied the tracks first, crouching low, running gloved fingers over bent spikes and torn steel. One engineer measured the spacing between the added claws. Another counted how many had broken. Karpov stood a few steps away, leaning against a tree. He had not slept in more than 30 hours. An officer from the 1st Guards Tank Army headquarters arrived just before dusk. He listened to the reports without speaking, then walked around Zarya himself. He stopped at the right track and looked at the torn metal where the spike had ripped free. "This was your work?" he asked. "Yes," Karpov replied. "Unauthorized modification?" "Yes." The officer looked up at the ridge, now marked with red flags and temporary positions. "Without it, we would still be below," he said. "And they would be above." That evening, the crew of Zarya was ordered to another tank. Their own machine was to be towed away for repair if possible. Before leaving, the commander wrote a short entry in his notebook. February 18, 1944. Near Novobuda. One Sherman crossed ice where none should. Not by engine, not by courage, but by teeth of iron. Karpov said nothing. He packed his tools and followed the crew. Zarya was recovered 2 days later. The damaged track was replaced. The spikes were removed by order, labeled field improvisation, not standard. They were stored briefly in a depot and then lost in later movements. No other tank officially used the same method. Some mechanics whispered about it. Some tried small versions of it on carts and tractors. None were recorded. Weeks later, as the army moved into Poland, Karpov found himself repairing a different Sherman near Kovel. The winter was easing. Ice was no longer the enemy. Mud was returning. A young mechanic asked him once if the story about the ice-clawed tank was true. Karpov only said, "If it is true, it is because it had to be." After the war, Karpov returned to railway work. He never wrote about Novobuda. He never spoke of it unless asked, and even then only briefly. In 1963, a historian from Kiev Military District Archives found a fragment of a report. Unusual traction modification observed on M4A2 during action south of Shepativka, February 1944. Vehicle crossed ice ridge under fire. Modification caused severe track stress and failure after prolonged use. Effectiveness situational. There was no name attached. Another diary, found later, from an infantry lieutenant, mentioned. One tank climbed like a beast with claws. Germans fired as if they could not believe it. Maybe they could not. No photograph of Zarya on the ridge has ever been found. No official diagram of the spikes exists. Some veterans swore it happened exactly as told. Others said it was exaggerated, that ice was not so hard, that any tank could have done it. Engineers argued that such spikes would tear tracks too quickly to be practical. Some said that was exactly why it worked only once. The ridge near Novobuda is quiet now. Trees grow where shells once struck. No sign remains of the ice that stopped steel and the steel that learned to bite it. But in one winter of one war, a foreign tank climbed a frozen ridge not because it was strong, or fast, or lucky, but because one man refused to accept that ice was stronger than iron. And for a few minutes on February 18, 1944, even the enemy stopped and stared. To the viewer, remember that history is not only shaped by generals and maps, but by hands in the cold, shaping metal so that men can live another hour.